So I'm relying on the information that's being entered into these repositories to understand the real risk that I'm facing. So that's one of the key challenges is you have to ensure that your source systems are complete and accurate, and you have to build a program around that.
SC Media and our sponsor RegScale are proud to present this month's CISO Stories program. Each month, the CISO Stories program explores a cybersecurity topic selected by Cyber Risk Alliance's CISO community and provides content that examines that topic from a variety of perspectives. Hosted by Todd Fitzgerald, best-selling author of CISO Compass, the CISO Stories weekly podcast features content powered by the 1,100-plus members of the Cyber Risk Alliance's CISO community. Listen to previous CISO Stories podcast episodes at CISOstoriespodcast.com. The Cybersecurity Collaborative is a unique membership community enabling cybersecurity leaders to work together in a trusted environment. To learn more, visit CISOstoriespodcast.com/CSC. I'm your host, Todd Fitzgerald, and this week we welcome Jonathan Ruff, Head of Cyber and Information Security Risk Management at Apple Bank. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you, Todd. Thank you for having me.
Great to have you here. So I always like to find out, it's a fascinating topic we're going to be talking about today, but what attracted you to the cybersecurity field?
So that's a really great question, because when I initially started in this industry, cybersecurity and security wasn't necessarily a big focal point. And it wasn't really until Sarbanes-Oxley came out that got me into identity and access management. That was like my first step into security, into cyber, and then I hate to date myself. That's going back 2003, but it just really took off from there, and as it grew, I grew with it, taking on more responsibility, taking on more initiatives with cyber, and now we're at this kind of pivotal moment where everything is relying on cyber.
I remember the Sarbanes-Oxley days, and all the consulting companies were just hungry to come in and help companies because people didn't know where their stuff was and how it was being protected, and that was a big thing to figure that out.
It was huge. It was huge, and I was at a very large financial institution that was going through multiple mergers, and now they are one of the largest financial institutions in the world. But it was really interesting to see the progression of how much regulations started to impact the business, specifically around information security and cyber risk, and now it's just overtaken, right? Everything that we do is based on cyber and privacy. So it's really an interesting evolution.
Absolutely. Well, today we're going to be talking about GRC, governance, risk, and compliance, and that's our theme this month on CISO Stories. So I'm excited to talk to you about this and doing a deep dive into GRC. So what sort of governance structure do you have in place at Apple Bank?
Yeah, so we have a fully deployed GRC solution. It took us about 3 years to really mature it to where it was completely integrated into every business line. This includes our compliance framework. This includes our risk assessments, our issues, our exceptions, any kind of risk acceptance, workflows, requests. So it's really a large gamut of different processes that we've brought in and really started to automate, connect, and report on, because that was obviously the biggest challenge, was reporting on all this information. And once we had the ability to bring it all into one centralized location, it really provided a lot of value.
So what sort of things are you looking at in your programming, connecting together?
So basically, at the end of the day, it's really connecting all of your control feeds into a GRC solution. So I've been in this space, specifically within the GRC space, for about 20 years now. So really, when the first product came, I'm going to be product agnostic, but when the first product came really into fruition, that's when we adopted it. In a former life, that's when we adopted it and began seeing the efficiencies and the effectiveness of having a GRC solution implemented. Before that, we had disparate systems. We had data that wasn't matching back to a business unit or a department. It was just very fragmented.
RegScale is a continuous controls monitoring platform purpose-built to deliver fast and efficient GRC outcomes by bridging security, risk, and compliance. Organizations using RegScale improve the ROI of existing tools, achieve rapid certifications like FedRAMP, SOX, and SOC 2, anticipate threats, automate evidence collection, integrate compliance into DevSecOps, and map controls faster using AI and OSCL native functionality. RegScale's customers report a 90% faster path to certifications and a 60% reduction in audit preparation efforts. To find out more about RegScale, visit CISOstoriespodcast.com/RegScale. So what sort of risk framework do you use, that not necessarily product wise, but to bring this stuff together?
So our primary framework for cyber risk management is the Cyber Risk Institute profile, and that is based off of NIST, Cybersecurity Framework 2.0. Now it was just released. On top of that, we're also the largest state chartered bank in New York. We are heavily regulated by the Department of Financial Services, Part 500, which is a very prescriptive regulatory body that mandates controls. Now, utilizing the profile from the Cyber Risk Institute, this is all mapped together. So you have the NYDFS Part 500. We're also heavily regulated by the FDIC, so that's mapped into it as well. So you have all your FFIEC handbooks that are into it. So when we're mapping to a specific function, which is the highest level in the framework, right, it drills down to your subcategory, your category, and ultimately your diagnostic statement, which is the controls that you have that apply to that particular regulation, right? Regardless of where it sits, this is the mapping that has been done. And then your control, right, is coming from your NIST 583, right? It essentially is what you're getting your guidance from. And you have that kind of all stacked up, and it's real linear, right? If you think about it. But automating this, right? Automating this process and putting them all into a GRC solution, putting this framework into a GRC solution, doing your risk assessments and starting to bring those control feeds in, right? Now it kind of gives you that continuous monitoring of your different controls and your different elements within the product. So you're able to easily identify if there's a failure, a weakness, or room for improvement, increase the efficacy of a particular control. And it also, and again, I have to be very transparent in the ability to consistently report on your cyber risk metrics. And I think that within all financial service sectors is one of the most important things, regardless of the facet of risk, cyber being one of the highest. It has to be consistent. You have to be able to demonstrate what you're doing and how you're complying with it.
So what sort of metrics are so important? And in fact, last month we were talking about metrics was our theme in our in the CISO Stories podcast. But when we look at the different controls that you bring in, what's an example of one of those controls that you've automated and brought into the GRC and that you've seen a lot of benefit from?
Well, so I guess I'll hit that at the top level one, right, which is vulnerability management, and I think that is the pinnacle KRI that everybody is struggling with, because there's so many different methodologies and calculations on determining if that vulnerability is really a critical to your unique institution or not. So one of the first things that we were able to bring in was the vulnerability management data, correlating it with our CMDB. So we had an idea, okay, we have an asset, we have a critical vulnerability. Is that critical, right? So if one of your tools, Qualys, or Rapid7, they're identifying it as critical. Your CVSS 3.1, we're now at 4.0, is saying it's critical. But is it critical to your organization, right? And that's where the context comes into it. And that's where GRC really plays the integral part of this. Because if that asset is not internet facing, if that asset is internal and doesn't contain any critical systems on it, then that vulnerability to me is getting bumped down, right? That's not on top of the list. Could be a 10, but within our organization, our unique landscape, it's not. And I think that's a great demonstration of understanding how beneficial these systems can be, is when you can now reduce the workload on IT, you can start to manage risk effectively, understanding where your real risk is. So if I had a critical vulnerability on an internet-facing system that's transactional, right, with customers or consumers, that I want to fix, right? I want to get in front of that ASAP. That's my first highest priority. I'm going to have IT remediate that, patch that, whatever they have to do to get that vulnerability removed. That's where I'm focusing on. And then if we take that a step further and look at not only vulnerabilities, but we look at different metrics like EDR and your different security suites that are on endpoints, bring that into it as well to truly understand, okay, yeah, we have a critical vulnerability on a system that's internet facing, transactional, consumer. However, we have X amount of compensating controls, right? We have micro-segmentation. We have the ability to have EDR quarantine this. So that's like the second layer.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a great example. And how do you take all that information that obviously starts out at a very detailed level and distill that upwards when you're, reporting this information to the board and trying to give them a sense of what risk you're accepting in the organization.
Right. Absolutely. We're definitely not going into the level of detail we just went over with the board. So what we have compiled was a methodology to do this, right? And it's based on risk tolerance. So we essentially shadow what other risk functions in the organization have done for decades: credit risk, liquidity risk, so forth and so on. And we quantify it. But I want to ensure when I say quantify, I'm not speaking monetarily, because I feel that we're still not at a position in the industry where we can, with confidence, suggest that X amount of money is at stake or is a loss, right? So we quantify it by the efficacy of the controls, the threat actors, the potential disruptions to our operations. That is how we're quantifying this. So we are listing out maybe 5 KRIs out of 26, and we're really raising up 2 KRIs that are meeting a board limit. And when I say a board limit, that is, okay, if it exceeds this threshold or tolerance, an action plan needs to happen.
What would some of those KRAs be that are important?
I'll tell you the two biggest ones, right? It's going to be phishing, right? Because that's crucial, and we're doing simulated phishing campaigns on a quarterly basis, and we're doing click rates. What's the click rate? And please forgive my terminology for click rate. It's no longer just clicking on a link. It's attachments. It's credential harvesting. It's living off the land. It's evolved. So we're not just sending a link in an email. It's much more complex. But I would say, as an industry term, we'll call it a click rate. And that's, who falls for the phish, who opens that attachment, who enables that macro, who enters their credentials in. And that's what we're reporting as a board limit. And then secondly, with the amount of vulnerable software that exists within our industry, within the world, within every program we use, we're looking at the vulnerabilities, right? And how many are getting remediated in the amount of time allotted for that. So you don't want that to exceed. So those are our two biggest KRIs that we look at. And that is really directed from the board and what they're hearing from other institutions. So that's the direction that we went, and have a board limit around that. Meaning, if we exceed that, an action plan must be established to resolve.
Well, and I think it's interesting that you're working for a financial institution and using the, not translating that necessarily into dollars. And I think that just shows how tough that is to actually do. I mean, that's where we're all trying to get to, right? But it's hard to get those real dollars that are believable, that have some actuarial basis, like, other things do.
Absolutely. I mean, we can look at if data is exfiltrated and it's not encrypted, right? We have a fiduciary responsibility to provide certain protections to our consumer base, and we know what that cost is, right? And that's maybe, I would say, 10% of it. But then you have to think about everything that is trailing behind that. Your regulatory fines, your reputation, your controls, how you have to bring them up. These are all costs that are kind of like hidden in and very difficult to understand, very difficult to try to quantify monetarily. So I think that we need a little bit more. We need a little bit more data around this, and we need a little bit more time. And there are some great practitioners out there. Just give a shout out to Jack Jones, and using the FAIR model. He's really been pushing this for quite some time. I'm a huge fan, and I've been studying it for years, but I still am not comfortable to introduce it into my organization.
Yeah, and we've had Jack on the CISO Stories podcast before as well. We've had Keith Richards on, who is doing some work, trying to get to those, doing some great work, trying to get to those numbers. We've had Doug Hubbard on the CISO Stories podcast, who has written the How to Measure Anything in Cybersecurity Risk. So, there's lots of different views out there, but it kind of shows where we are as an industry. We're just not. We just don't have enough data yet, and it's also difficult because we don't share that data across each other as freely either. So we have a lot of those obstacles in there. So what sort of obstacles did you have, putting your GRC program in place, and how do you get over those obstacles? What were some of those key challenges that you had?
I'll say the biggest key challenge is the accuracy and completeness of your data that is feeding your GRC, right? Your GRC should, from my perspective, should never be a source system. It should retrieve information or ingest information from source systems, such as application inventories, CMDBs, vulnerability scanners, and correlate that. But that information needs to be accurate, meaning I need to know, and we alluded to this earlier in this podcast, that having a vulnerability that's critical. If that's not entered into the system properly, then I don't know if it is internet facing or not, right? So I'm relying on the information that's being entered into these repositories to understand the real risk that I'm facing. So that's one of the key challenges is you have to ensure that your source systems are complete and accurate, and you have to build a program around that. I wouldn't even deploy a GRC solution until I did that work. And that work can take a couple years, right? Because you're cleaning up every system. You're cleaning up HR data, right? You're making sure that you have a proper business hierarchy, that everything flows down from that consistent single source of truth. Now we can start to aggregate, right? We could start to put our assets to these business departments. We can have accountability of these assets, these applications, the infrastructure components. When we have that accountability and we have that complete and accurate data source, and we have that business hierarchy that's kind of the umbrella of everything, then it's much easier to have a successful deployment. Without that, you will ultimately run into challenges. You will have inaccurate sources of data. And the last thing that you want to do is have a GRC solution implemented, because it's not cheap, and it's not fast. And you don't want to bring inaccurate information into that board meeting.
I have to ask you, I really like what you're saying there, because, one of the difficulties is the disparate data sources that we have. And then how do we know that they're even accurate? Sometimes until you bring them together, you see that the records just don't match with the different systems. We're in this age of AI today. How do you see AI shaping, changing, the GRC of the future?
Wow. I mean, that's a loaded question, right?
I'm not even expecting you to have the answer to that. It's probably more of a thought-provoking question you probably haven't spent a lot of time with yet.
Absolutely, right? Because everywhere I go, AI, it's all I hear, right? So how is that going to change, GRC? And it really is more philosophical. I can't really, give you a definitive answer on how that works. But what I see is that if you can train, these models, these AI models, to understand these particular structures within your organization, it could start to do a lot of the manual remediation and reconciliation tasks of getting that data cleansed, right? And even to the point, and this is another really big thing, and one initiative that's, I think, also very tremendous, is classifying your data. So if you can train that model to classify your data, so I know this is an SSN, right? Or I know this is a bank account number, or I know this is a financial statement stored here, right? AI can run through and automate all of that, where it may have taken a week, 2 weeks to do every month. Because remember, as a financial institution, hopefully you're continuing to grow, right, at a rapid pace. So you're having more and more information that's coming in every month. And now you can start to break that down to doing it daily. I mean, that would be my goal. If I can get AI to do that on a daily basis, that would be a huge win for me.
Excellent. Well, this has been a great conversation. I think, this is such an important piece of any organization that's trying to manage their risk. What sort of advice would you give to new CISOs, current CISOs, emerging CISOs, experienced CISOs, as they're trying to implement GRC programs in their companies?
So my advice would be to know your data, know your sources. Don't believe that a GRC solution on its own is going to solve all your problems. It's not. You have to have the processes in place first. You have to have your source systems. Those are your central sources of truth. And you have to be able to integrate them into your GRC solution. If you can achieve that, then that is the best point that you can build off of. And now you can start to introduce more sophistication in your GRC program. But it all starts with the cleanliness of that data. And one thing I have to emphasize, because I've learned this over 20 years, I've been preaching this same concept. Get your business hierarchy correct, consistent, and everybody buying in on it. All your stakeholders must understand that there is a business hierarchy. And if you go through M&A, or if you go through a divestiture, right? You need to take that into consideration and show how that breaks down into your GRC platform as well, right? Because we can't have risk just sitting out there.
I think that's an excellent advice, and we have so many examples of mergers where afterwards there was a breach, and you got to be careful what you're acquiring and assessing that correctly. So thanks a lot. It's been great talking with you today. I've enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.
Same here. Todd, this has been excellent. I've really, really enjoyed the conversation as well.
Thank you for tuning in to this week's episode of the CISO Stories podcast. We want to say a special thank you to our sponsor, RegScale. Please subscribe to the CISO Stories podcast and you will receive a new story each Tuesday at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. We'll see you next week for a new episode.